On January 25, 2026, at precisely 1 p.m., residents of Niscemi, Sicily received a warning that gave them exactly 4 minutes to abandon everything they owned. Not 4 hours, not 40 minutes. 4 minutes to grab what they could carry and run as the ground beneath their neighborhood began its slow, grinding slide toward the Moio River Valley below. Within those 4 minutes, over 500 people became refugees in their own city, fleeing homes that had stood for generations as the earth beneath them transformed from solid foundation into flowing paste. But here is what makes this truly unprecedented. This was not the first time. Just 9 days earlier, on January 16, 2026, a landslide 1.6 kilometers wide had torn through the same region, creating vertical scarps from 20 to 23 feet high. Drops the height of a 2-story building appearing overnight. The ground did not stop moving after that initial failure. It kept creeping, inch by inch, day after day, toward the river valley. And now, on January 25th, a second massive failure had activated, suggesting that what authorities initially treated as an isolated geological event was actually a progressive collapse, affecting the entire hillside beneath Niscemi. Mayor Massimiliano Conti, in a statement delivered hours after the evacuation, said they were experiencing a dramatic landslide event that continues to evolve. He said the ground is broken. You cannot walk on it. We cannot predict when or if these families will return to their homes. The hillside beneath our community is sliding, and we are powerless to stop it. Is this a tragic but containable natural disaster, triggered by extreme weather, that will stabilize once conditions normalize? Evidence that Cyclone Harry's unprecedented rainfall fundamentally destabilized geology across Sicily in ways that will continue producing failures for months or years, or proof that Mediterranean communities built on clay-rich slopes are approaching a reckoning where increasingly extreme weather makes catastrophic ground failure inevitable. To understand why a Sicilian hillside is disintegrating beneath a populated town, you need to understand what Cyclone Harry did to the ground and why the geology beneath Niscemi was a disaster, waiting for exactly that trigger. Sicily's interior terrain is dominated by sedimentary formations, ancient seabeds uplifted over millennia by tectonic forces. These formations consist primarily of clay and sand units, layers of clay interbedded with sand and silt. When dry, these materials maintain significant strength through cohesion between particles. Clay minerals bond together and sand grains interlock, so the material can support substantial weight, buildings, roads, entire communities. But when saturated with water, the physics change catastrophically. Water infiltrates the spaces between particles, filling voids and creating what geologists call pore pressure, the pressure exerted by water trapped in the soil. As pore pressure increases, it pushes particles apart and reduces the friction that holds the material together. The effect of stress, the force keeping soil grains in contact, decreases. At a critical threshold, cohesion fails entirely, and the material behaves not like solid ground, but like a thick paste capable of flowing downhill under its own weight. The terrain around Niscemi shows classic erosion patterns that indicate long-term instability. Calanche phenomena, deeply incised erosion ravines with steep walls and sharp ridges, scar the landscape. These features form in clay-rich materials through cycles of wetting and drying that progressively break down the soil structure. The presence of extensive Calanche terrain is a geological warning sign. This is ground that erodes easily, that loses strength when wet, that has a history of instability. The slope geometry compounds the vulnerability. Niscemi sits on hillsides that descend toward the Moio River Valley. Gravity constantly exerts downslope stress on the soil mass. Under normal conditions, the strength of the material resists this stress, and the slope remains stable. But reduce that strength through saturation, and gravity wins. The soil begins moving downslope at rates that can range from millimeters per day to meters per hour, depending on conditions. For decades, the slopes beneath Niscemi remained marginally stable. Residents built homes. Infrastructure was installed. Roads connected the community to surrounding areas. Minor slope movements occurred: cracks in walls, settling foundations, occasional rockfalls, but nothing suggesting imminent catastrophic failure. Then Cyclone Harry struck Sicily, with rainfall intensities that exceeded anything in modern meteorological records. From January 12th to January 15th, 2026, Cyclone Harry, a rare Mediterranean tropical-like cyclone with hurricane characteristics, stalled over southern Italy and Sicily. Rainfall totals across the region were extraordinary. Parts of Calabria received 570 millimeters in 72 hours, nearly an entire year's precipitation compressed into one weekend. Wind gusts exceeded 120 kilometers per hour. Coastal buoys recorded wave heights reaching 16 meters, 52 feet, documenting storm intensity that occurs perhaps once per century. The rain didn't just fall, it saturated. Clay soils, dried and fractured from preceding dry months, initially absorbed water rapidly as rainfall filled desiccation cracks. But as saturation progressed, infiltration rates decreased and water began accumulating in subsurface layers. The clay swelled as it absorbed moisture. Pore pressures increased throughout the hillside. The strength of the soil mass progressively declined. On January 16th, the hillside reached its failure threshold. Residents reported hearing sounds unlike anything associated with typical landslides, not sharp cracks or sudden crashes, but a continuous grinding rumble from deep underground. Then, the ground began moving. A failure front, approximately 1.6 kilometers wide, activated. Vertical scarps appeared as blocks of hillside dropped and rotated backward. Roads split open. Provincial Road 12, a critical transportation corridor, was destroyed as sections of pavement dropped meters below their original elevation. Gas lines ruptured. Fiber optic cables were severed. Homes developed massive cracks as their foundations were undermined. Monitoring equipment deployed immediately after the failure detected continuing movement, and the ground was creeping toward the Moio River Valley at rates of several centimeters per day. This was not a single catastrophic collapse that stabilized. It was progressive failure, where the initial movement removed support from upslope material and triggered further collapse in a retrogressive pattern. Emergency services evacuated residents from the most immediately threatened areas and established monitoring protocols. Engineers assessed damage and attempted to predict the failure zone's extent. The assumption was that the January 16th event represented the main failure, that continued movement would gradually decelerate, and that within weeks, conditions would stabilize enough to assess recovery options. 9 days later, at 1 p.m. on January 25th, that assumption proved catastrophically wrong. Residents in a neighborhood that had shown no obvious damage from the January 16th failure heard the grinding sound returning. Within minutes, asphalt streets began splitting in real time. Cracks spread like veins through pavement. But the most terrifying observation was that the ground was not shaking. It was translating. Entire sections of the neighborhood were sliding forward, intact but moving, as the hillside beneath them flowed toward the valley. Emergency services issued immediate evacuation orders via text message, loudspeakers, and door-to-door warnings. Residents had 4 minutes, the time emergency officials estimated before road access would be cut off by ground deformation. Over 500 people fled, most carrying only essentials hastily grabbed. They left behind homes that represented generations of family history, structures built by grandparents, childhood homes, accumulated possessions of entire lives. By 2 p.m., the neighborhood was empty. Roads were impassable. Walls had buckled. The continuous rumbling sound persisted for hours as the ground continued its slow-motion collapse. The January 25th failure was not isolated from the January 16th event. It was an expansion of the same progressive, multi-phase collapse, indicating that the entire hillside beneath portions of Niscemi was failing in a complex, multi-phase process that showed no signs of stabilizing. The cascading consequences revealed how unprepared communities are for disasters that do not resolve quickly, but instead persist and expand over weeks. The transportation crisis became acute. Provincial Road 10 was closed immediately following the January 25th failure. Provincial Road 12 had already been destroyed by the January 16th event. That left Provincial Road 11 as the only remaining connection between Niscemi and surrounding communities. Approximately 25,000 people, not just in Niscemi, but in surrounding areas, now depended on a single road for access to essential services, emergency response, and economic activity. If Provincial Road 11 failed or became compromised by continuing ground movement, entire communities would face isolation. Emergency services would be unable to reach residents. Commercial deliveries would cease. The economic and safety implications of having a single point of failure for transportation were becoming devastatingly clear. The evacuation created immediate humanitarian needs. The municipal sports palace was converted into an emergency shelter. Hundreds of camp beds were set up. Approximately 70 volunteers from civil protection agencies coordinated food distribution, medical support, and basic services for families who had lost access to their homes within 4 minutes. Schools closed indefinitely. Without a clear assessment of ground stability, administrators could not guarantee student safety. This extended closure disrupted education and created childcare challenges for working families. The psychological toll on evacuees was profound. Interviews with displaced residents revealed the trauma of losing not just homes, but the certainty of place. One elderly woman described a home that had been in her family for over a century, built by her grandfather, maintained through generations, now sitting in a red zone with ground creeping beneath it. The question that haunted evacuees was not just whether they could return, but when they would know if returning was even possible. The response revealed fundamental limitations in how geological disasters can be managed when failure is progressive rather than instantaneous. Italian civil protection authorities mobilized national resources. The Minister of Civil Protection personally visited Niscemi and promised full support. Teams of geologists from Rome were deployed to assess the situation and provide expertise beyond what local authorities could access. But assessment teams faced a challenge that distinguishes this disaster from earthquakes or floods. Landslides can remain active for indeterminate periods. The ground could continue moving for days, weeks, months, or even years. Unlike an earthquake that happens and ends, or a flood that recedes, a landslide in clay-rich terrain can persist as long as conditions favoring movement remain. Continuous monitoring was established using GPS stations, inclinometers, and visual surveys. The data confirmed ongoing movement, but could not predict when or if stabilization would occur. The failure zone could expand further upslope through retrogressive collapse, and additional neighborhoods could be threatened. The uncertainty made planning nearly impossible. The critical question that emerged was whether the January 16th and January 25th events were separate failures or different phases of a single massive collapse. If they were separate, they might represent discrete responses to Cyclone Harry's rainfall that would stabilize independently. If they were interconnected, they would suggest a much larger failure zone was active, a scenario with far more severe implications for community safety and recovery. Preliminary geological analysis suggested interconnection. The failure geometries, the timing, and the progressive nature of movement all indicated a massive hillside failure affecting multiple square kilometers. If that interpretation is correct, substantial portions of Niscemi sit atop actively failing ground. Today, hundreds of Niscemi residents remain in emergency shelters or with relatives, unable to return home. Monitoring continues around the clock. Provincial Road 11 remains open, but under constant surveillance for any signs of ground deformation. Schools remain closed. The community exists in a suspended crisis, The disaster has not ended, and no one can predict when or how it will resolve. The systems we built to manage natural disasters, emergency response protocols, evacuation procedures, shelter operations, assume events have clear beginnings and endings. They are designed for earthquakes that last seconds, floods that recede in days, storms that pass. They struggle with disasters that persist indefinitely, that evolve and expand, that create sustained displacement without clear resolution timelines. Are we truly prepared for geological disasters in an era of increasingly extreme weather, or merely documenting our inability to protect communities built on marginal geology when unprecedented rainfall triggers failures that do not stop? The monitoring instruments continue recording movement. Engineers analyze data looking for stabilization signals. Evacuees wait for news about their homes. Mayor Conti faces impossible decisions about when, if ever, to allow residents to return. Somewhere beneath Niscemi, in saturated clay layers meters thick, the ground continues its slow transformation from solid to fluid. It continues its inexorable slide toward the Moio River Valley. Cyclone Harry triggered the process, but the fundamental geology ensures it will persist according to physics, indifferent to human timelines or needs. The hillside is collapsing, not because warning systems failed or construction was substandard. It is collapsing because we built communities on clay-rich slopes that were always marginally stable, and extreme weather delivered saturation that pushed marginal stability past the threshold where ground becomes paste and gravity wins. Who will pay the price when the next Mediterranean cyclone arrives? When rainfall again saturates slopes across Sicily? When other communities built on similar geology experience similar failures? When we are forced to acknowledge that increasingly extreme weather makes living on certain landscapes untenable, regardless of how long communities have occupied them? That question has no answer yet. Only the sound of grinding from underground, the measurements showing continuing displacement, the empty homes in red zones, and the recognition that we have built communities on geology that modern climate conditions are revealing to be fundamentally unstable. Ground that appeared solid for generations but was always temporary, waiting for conditions that would transform foundation into flowing mud.